The press that's enshrined in our Constitution, our First Amendment, the free press, was often a scurrilous press. We're supposed to trouble the government. We're supposed to challenge the government.
The U.S. drops thousands of tons of bombs on the Vietnamese people every day. How can Nixon claim to be upset about a few eggs thrown at him?
We were trying to exercise every tactical stratagem we could to stop the war in Vietnam.
Where Ramparts really gets liftoff is when Warren recruits Bob Scheer.
Bob does the interview with Jimmy Carter, where Jimmy Carter says he has lust in his heart.
If you think crimes have been conducted in your name by your government, then you have an obligation to become a whistleblower. We are not the indispensable agents of history. When we come to believe we are, we do much more damage than we do good.
He's of the same line as Walter Lippmann and Murray Kempton and Izzy Stone. These are journalists who are essentially historians, but they're historians dealing with living history. They don't have to go back to the books, to what other people have written. Maybe because I grew up among immigrants, you know, where I grew up in the Bronx, I mean, foreign languages were everywhere, and everybody was coming from some other place and had some story. And I grew up loathing an America-centric view of the world. I always had the idea that everybody matters. My parents were garment workers, and I knew they mattered. I knew their friends mattered. I knew the people in my neighborhood mattered. Some fell off. My father would take me down to the Bowery, show me people who were lined up to get food. No one ever gave me a reason to think that these people were not equal to me and to anyone else. I was always raised with the idea there was an inherent value to human life.
What I don't feel I know is what makes you tick. What happened to you at 11 or 12 or 14 or earlier that turned you on to the kind of citizen you are?
Oh, it was just in the air. I was born in '36. My father and mother, my mother was the other woman.
What do you mean the other woman?
My father was married, had a couple of children. They met on a picket line. They were both garment workers. My father was a German Protestant. My mother was a Russian Jew. They happened to fall in love. I got my father's name. I knew I was a good street hustler. I was working when I was 12 and a half. I could make deals. I could run orders.
What kind of deals?
You know, anything anybody wanted. I could sell sodas at the Guardian. I could do it at Lewiston Stadium. I was a good hustler. And
what's the cleverest thing you ever hustled as a kid? What was your cleverest hustle?
Oh, my cleverest thing was standing in front of the garden and looking forlorn like a street urchin. Hey, mister, you got an extra ticket? Guy said, I don't know. Well, let me see if she shows up. The girlfriend didn't show up. He'd give me the tickets, maybe give me both. I run around to the other side of the garden and sell them. That's my. I was doing that 3-4 nights a week. Yeah. It was called mooching. You know, but let me ask you, because you know I have to say something but you've been my role model, okay? I don't want to embarrass you, and making you responsible.
But you know, I feel the same way about you. All you've got on me is youth and smarts. No, but a lot of smarts. Wait a minute, this is my interview of you.
I was sort of born into an environment in which you could not avoid politics for all sorts of reasons. I was born in 1936 in Bronx Hospital, April 4th, 1936, and my father lost his job that day. And this was, for him, the beginning of the Depression. He didn't get it back until the war came along. My father's family were German, my mother's Jewish. My father's family in Germany was killing my mother's family in Lithuania. Those were all live issues. Relatives would arrive from the respective old countries. So half my relatives in New York were German Protestants, half were Russian Jews. I went from one to the other. And what united them was politics. They all were on the progressive side of things. My father had been a wobbly and socialist, and very briefly even a communist was thrown out of the party for leading a wildcat strike at the New York knitting mills. My childhood game was killing krauts, except my father was clearly a kraut, had a strong German accent, and all my German relatives, on the other hand, they were very strong anti-fascists. They were more strong anti-fascists than anyone else I knew, because they were particularly had been involved with Spain and, you know, supporting the struggle against fascism in Spain. My mother came over from Lithuania when she was 21. My mother in Lithuania had been involved with this group, the Jewish Socialist Bund, and two of her sisters were killed by the Tsar's police organizing. So this group, the Jewish Socialist Bund, used my mother to carry messages in her hair, and one terrifying scene, she went to a town to deliver this message to someone who had already been arrested, and she was put up near the prison by some sympathizers, and she could hear the fellow being tortured all night. It was an important family story. Her group had been, for a short time, allied with the Bolsheviks. And then Lenin denounced their group. And suddenly they were hunted people. This revolution that they had fought for was now gone south for them. My mother knew negative things about the Soviet Union quite early. That she was a sympathizer in that she still felt the revolution was a progressive agency up to a point. You got to remember, New York City Council, when I was growing up, had 3 communists on the city council. Everybody forgets about the history of the communists in the United States. They were very involved and maybe at the center of the whole civil rights movement, as they had been very important to the labor movement.
It was a question of survival for you.
Yeah, well, when I read Margaret Sanger and the early birth control movement, I'm the person they didn't think had to be born, right? Mm-hmm. Parents didn't have good jobs and, you know, and so forth. How do you take care of a little kid? My mother's a garment worker. I'm parked in a carriage by my Uncle Leon's fruit stand. And, you know, I can, to this day, hear, 4 for a quarter, 4 for a quarter, from Florida. Look, I was raised by the women in my neighborhood because my mother was working, so the women who stayed home, they'd make sure, hey, Bobby, you got to have some milk, you know, or did you get some lunch, you know? And, you know, Miss Nussbaum down on the 3rd floor, you know, I had to check in with her when I came in, you know, as a 3rd grader. And I would say among my circle of friends these days, I'm the only one that's actually been food deprived. You know, food was an issue, okay? So when I was 12 and a half, there was a Meyerowitsch's grocery store right on the corner of this project at the Coops. And I was already starting to deliver orders for Meyerowitsch. So Meyerowitsch got this idea, he had a big station wagon, that he would get the big milk delivery to his store, and then he'd put it on the corners around this project, which was like basically 3 blocks going that way. And then he would have kids deliver the milk at 4 or 5 in the morning. Only no one, other parents would let their kids do it. So I was the only one. And my father thought that, yes, you have a job, you know, that's good, you know. And when I was doing my milk deliveries, well, let's see, this is about 1948, 49. I made this discovery that, because I'm the only one out there, and I'm seeing all these books by the garbage cans. And I remember 2 in particular that I dragged home. One was the collected works of Stalin. I think it was 12 or 13 volumes. It was kind of red covers. And one was the collected works of, amazingly enough, Thomas Jefferson. They were big green volumes, and the collected letters and works of Thomas Jefferson. I think there were like 20 of them or something, 25 of them. And I brought them to this tiny little apartment we had. I had them like under my bed. That showed you the temper of the time. People were afraid. The FBI was all over this neighborhood. We call them the Phoebes. And you could tell them by their antennas, unmarked cars. And people were arrested. And I brought the Jefferson, I remember, with me to graduate school in Berkeley, so I had them with me up till then. Look, it was an atmosphere that could have soured me, and I could have become very out for myself. You know, I want to feather my nest.
What's the strongest reason why you didn't?
Because I enjoyed people, I really did. I found my salvation on the street corner, in the candy store, and neighbors, playing ball. I just liked it. I liked the people there.
Was there anything in all of the experience you've just described that suggests journalism would follow?
I liked everybody's story. Everybody had a story, and I had no hierarchy of whose story is important. But somebody once said about journalism, in any story I want to know who's getting screwed and who's doing the screwing. And that has been the motto of my whole life, okay? I don't like people getting screwed over. I want to know who's screwing them over. I arrived in Berkeley, and what was really exciting was not Berkeley. What was exciting was North Beach, and that was the beats. Beats and jazz. Tremendous jazz in San Francisco, as good as there was anywhere in the world. And you had the beatniks, and the beatniks were reading poems to jazz, and the marriage of poetry and jazz. And so I wrote a piece about Allen Ginsberg, which was an attack on the traditional left. And it was called Poet is Priest in Root and Branch, kind of a student lefty magazine, saying, listen, the old left was all wrong, and Ginsberg is right.
Bob and I hadn't gotten together yet, so I think he showed up in my life anyway, in 1958. And he was what he proudly announced to me, a term I had never heard, a red diaper baby. And they were almost all red diaper babies. David Horowitz among them, probably the most left-wing of the whole group.
It was an incredible group, and we put out this publication, Root and Branch. And so Horowitz, who then soon after wrote a book called Student, celebrates, quotes something I wrote in Student, showing the free spirit of the New Left and how we were not at all inclined to be communists or suppress free speech, but quite the opposite. And I was held up as the poster child. All of us rejected these communist countries. We all knew they were totalitarian. That was not an issue. Now, Horowitz, however, rejected it from a Trotskyist position. They should have had permanent revolution. Others, I think Maurice would be one who rejected it more from a social democratic position and democracy, workers' control. And the negative on Berkeley was that it was now a conservative, suppressed campus, because California public education, higher education, had come under a late variant of McCarthyism. And we had the big loyalty oath battle, or they had the big loyalty oath battle, and the Federal Un-American Activities Committee, which was, blacklisting people, which was getting people fired and imprisoning them. And that became actually one of the first big demonstrations in the Bay Area was against UAC, a very important part of which I participated in that first year that I went out there.
And so we planned to have a demonstration, a peaceful demonstration, picketing against the House Un-American Activities Committee.
We met with a few other graduate students at Berkeley. We said, hey, they're coming here. We should do this. We put out the word and so forth.
So we organized, we made signs, we organized a picket, went and picketed.
And our great concern actually was that it not get disruptive. This was, early on, this is before the 60s, it was just 1960, and there hadn't been much of this.
But what was great was somehow or other we got to talk to Harry Bridges before that.
Harry Bridges was himself a target of UAC. So you had your warehouseman workers, your longshore, and in those days longshore was still a big activity, unloading boats by hand and track. And so you had a strong labor movement that didn't want coming there and harassing people.
So that day of infamy, There were over, I mean, I hope I'm not exaggerating, there were several thousand dock workers who showed up. Okay, so that really was a danger, that you have ordinary workers from a left union that are now marching there.
And so we thought there'd be agent provocateurs and so forth who would come and become more disruptive, and we were there to hand out our leaflets and give our message of what was wrong with UAC.
But there were these kids from Stanford University who went into the building and banged on the doors. Down with the committee! Down with the committee! Abolish UAC! Right?
And the next thing you knew, our whole crowd out there on the street rushed into, into the building.
Sure enough, of course, all of a sudden the cops come racing out.
They brought out these hoses and flooding down the steps. The steps were quite steep and slippery. And we, swept down, hosed us down the stairs, and people were arrested.
The cops come beating people with their clubs on the head. One of the kids, I still remember her, Mary McIntosh, she was bleeding like this. And this is not a joke. They come in and they're going to swing at Bob. He says, wait a minute, I'm an anti-communist. Guy says, I don't care what kind of communist you are.
And there's this flood of water coming down the steps, and people are slipping and sliding and hurting themselves, aside from the police brutality, and there's absolute mayhem. So then, my memory is we kind of went into triage there, trying to get help to people who were bleeding and, hurting in different ways, and that became the news story. And what I can tell you categorically is we did not create it.
It was a disaster for the students, but symbolically it became a rallying point, because students would show up at other demonstrations or rallies that we were organizing who didn't know a damn thing about UAC, but now identified with fellow students because they couldn't believe this is America and students are getting beat up over the head by policemen.
The UAC demonstration was a very big part of the development of the Bay Area. The connection of all these movements, the peace movement, the civil rights movement. It was also, UAC's moment was over.
He took off for Cuba almost immediately after the revolutionaries came to power, sometime in 1960, when it was still easy to go there.
Cuba, the first couple of years of the Cuban Revolution, the beats, believe it or not, were playing a role. That's why Lawrence Ferlinghetti wrote his 1,000 Fearful Words for Fidel. And they had a publication called Lunas in the official Communist Party Revolucion newspaper. The people running that Monday edition, they all thought the Beats were kind of their role model, not Karl Marx. And they printed Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti and all these people.
And he came back, he said, Zeitlin, it's amazing what's going on down there. This is a genuine revolution. We got to write about it. At the time we were making speeches, and this is no exaggeration, okay? I would speak not as long as Fidel, but sometimes 3 or 4 hours, okay? And as the classes would change, so at each hour there was a new, new masses to agitate, and eventually there were really thousands, I kid you not, there were thousands of students at Buñuel Plaza, and then Bob would take over. So we were like the Bobbsey twins. I mean, we were agitators and pamphleteers and speech makers. And Ferlinghetti came up after one of our speeches and he said, I'd like you guys to write a book for me. Okay, I really like the way you guys talk and I would like you to write a book for me for, City Lights Books. I'll be glad to publish it. But you got to get it to me while everything is still, in the air. So we wrote this book and handed him the manuscript, and he had this look on his face as, how is he going to tell these guys? This is not the book I expected you to write. It has footnotes, and it has an appendix with tables. What were you thinking? I wanted a broadside like you guys talk. So we were, so upset. And I don't know how we got in touch with Barney Rossett at Grove Books, who at the time was publishing the kinds of books that were banned. And he published a book.
Cuba Tragedy in Our Hemisphere was the Grove Press version. And so at the end of this whole thing, and here I had a book and I was very proud of it. It was a big deal. We were both graduate students, and I just want Maurice to get a lot of credit for it because I learned a lot from him. In my case, I perished publishing because I had a fellowship at the Center for Chinese Studies, and we had some real harsh Cold War hawks who were on the board of the Center for Chinese Studies, which was basically a part of a CIA front, and they engineered the yanking of my money that I would not be a fellow.
Even then, it was clear that Bob had a reporter's flair, that he was a journalist.
I think the thesis of our book was correct, and I think it's the connection with the Vietnam Project, which came for me right after, which is whatever you think of these communist governments around the world, they were not mere extensions of the Soviet Union.
What made you, how did you happen to come down on the side of the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence?
It was a very simple choice. At City College, I was studying engineering, and because that was what I was good at and I could make a living. And I went down to sit in at a class, and I ended up taking called Basic Issues of American Democracy. Everything was an issue. Everything. What does free speech mean? What is the Fourth Amendment? What does any of this mean? What are the values on both sides? And it was basically a debate. You know, what is this Constitution all about? Basic issues of American democracy. We talked about segregation, we talked about war and peace, talked about everything. And I thought, wow.
And you knew what side you were on going in?
No, I liked the fact that there were issues. Whether it was about McCarthyism, whether it was about the Korean War, it was all up for grabs. And you could get a different piece of it. And then I discovered the 42nd Street Library and the City College Library. And I could go down there, and I could come back a few days later and know more than my professor did about it, you know, and try to persuade him. And I would say that learning as an activity, as a sport, as a source of joy, became the main thing going.
He was a graduate student in Berkeley. I told Bob, leave Berkeley and come to the reality of North Beach. He worked at the store about 3-4 years, I think.
At City Lights, you know, it was a great bookstore. People have never seen City Lights. It's still there. My job was to open the store at 10 o'clock. I'd open up all the new magazines coming in. I'd open up the books that came in. And, you know, they'd be all around me on the counter. I could be there, like I say, 2 hours earlier. I had to sweep the place for the night before and clean it up. And then very often I'd close the place. And I got a hell of an education there, and that's how I got interested in Vietnam. I opened up a magazine, China Quarterly, and I opened up a French publication, Nouvel Observateur. And these people were writing about the stupidity that the Americans were following in Vietnam and not learning the lessons from the French. Then I went over to Berkeley to check on Vietnam, and what happened was I found one day a packet of papers, and nobody had opened this up. There was some dust on it and a ribbon around it. So I blew off the dust and opened this up. This was all about how Michigan State Police Project had trained the police in Vietnam and Saigon. And Stanley Scheinbaum, who had been the co-director of the Michigan State Project. By that time, he was a source of mine in doing this research. He had been used to be cover for the CIA project. And it had to do with torture, had to do with the secret police, had to do with all of this. All by way of shoring up Ngo Dinh Diem, the guy that the U.S. had been picked to be the George Washington of South Vietnam when it decided it was going to not honor the Geneva Accords and not have elections, and that Ho Chi Minh would have won those elections. Paul Krasner, who was editing a magazine called The Realist magazine, I said I could write something about this. And he said, that's good. And I said, but I should go to Vietnam. He said, where's that or something? He didn't know. It was pretty early on. I said, well, for $1,467.36, I can get this ticket right now this afternoon, round-trip ticket, and I can go and pursue these stories that I'm interested in. And bless him, he had just made a bunch of money off his "Fuck Communism" posters. He wrote a check out, and I go out and got the ticket, I think, that afternoon. And I went to Vietnam. What happened was I wrote this pamphlet, and the pamphlet took off.
One of the first things Bob ever wrote was a pamphlet called How the U.S. Got Involved in Vietnam. And it sold over 1 million copies, and it was hugely influential. And people still come up to us and say, you know, you got me to change my opinion of the Vietnam War. You got me to come out against the Vietnam War.
I read that and felt if I'd read this in 64, 65, I would never have gone to Vietnam. It wasn't just that I thought it was a loser. I would no longer have seen it as a legitimate struggle for us to be in. It was clear from the real history of Vietnam, and Bob was better at that. His account was better as an account that was available from almost anyone else at that point of the American involvement. It was clear that what we had here was a neo-colonial, an imperial involvement, where we were governing the place through our proxies, basically, which meant that it had no legitimacy from an American point of view, as I saw it.
Thousands of young men in this district are being asked to kill in Vietnam and possibly be killed. They know next to nothing about the history or culture of Vietnam. They've been continuously lied to by their administration. The news about Vietnam has been continuously manipulated. The American position in Vietnam has been continuously distorted by the administration. This campaign is aimed at opposing the war. It is my position that the United States should never have become involved in Vietnam, should never have stayed in Vietnam, and should now get out.
I ran for Congress against the Democratic candidate, Jeffrey Cohalan, who was supposed to be a liberal guy, but he was supporting Johnson in the war, and that was his whole defense. Scheer doesn't know what he's talking about. I've been at these briefings. I know what the communists are up to. I know what's going on in Vietnam. You know, and it was a big lie because it was all based on the idea of a monolithic communist movement, and the Vietnamese were just part of an international communist conspiracy, and that was garbage. And the government knew it was garbage.
And there was a group of radical or liberal professors at Berkeley called the Faculty Peace Committee. So they met with Bobby and I, and they asked him if he would consider running for Congress, because Bobby was such a good speaker and was so deeply, you know, involved in the history of Vietnam, the knowledge that he had. But when he ran for Congress, we were trying to exercise every tactical stratagem we could to stop the war in Vietnam. We could be stopping troop trains. We could be getting arrested in some demonstration. And we could be doing all of the above at the same time.
I think we're making this demonstration today because we want to confront the citizens in this community with the enormity of this crime, to bring the reality of that war home to them. And this is, in fact, our war. All of our wars. Whether we are against it, whether we parade against it or we are for it, is a war waged in our name. And as one who has had to travel through villages in both South Vietnam and in Cambodia, which were bombed out by American bombs, and confront the people in those villages whose parents, whose sons, whose sisters died as a result of that bombing, I can tell you they held me accountable as much as they would hold someone who supports the war accountable. Because I was an American, I looked like an American, it was my government.
There were some friendships that broke up over Bobby running for Congress. So he did get kind of the ultra left, I wouldn't even call it that, but there was a part of the left that was harshly critical because he was in that arena running for Congress. But I don't think he and I felt, I mean, we've always felt like this is just another tactic to try and stop the war.
I knew something then that I learned painfully while I ran for office, that whatever your intentions, you're going to give the same speech 7 times a day. You're going to look for the applause lines. You're going to simplify it a bit. And I started to not like myself very much doing that.
It's interesting, Bobby is probably one of the best speakers in my whole life. I mean, to this date. But in my whole life with him, he would worry every speech. Like he'd sit in the bathtub for hours, you know, trying to, just to I guess, get himself ready. But he was never comfortable, like glib.
In 1966, I vividly remember when Scheer ran for Congress on a 2-pronged platform to end poverty in Oakland and end the war in Vietnam. And I was a 14-year-old nervous Nelly for Scheer, as the slogan had it. That was the phrase that was used by the Johnson administration, and I think Johnson himself, or at least his speechwriters, to caricature and castigate those who questioned the efficacy and legitimacy of American intervention in Vietnam. Then I still have campaign buttons. It was then that I met, in passing, his 24-year-old campaign manager, the inimitable Alice Waters.
I ended up driving him to some of the engagements that he had around Berkeley and other places. And I would sit in the audience, if you will, and I could have heard it over and over again. I did hear it over and over again, but it just became sort of my thinking about the war. And when he lost, I didn't want to have anything to do with politics again. I always tell him the story that then when he lost, I opened Chez Panisse.
We stepped on a lot of toes in this area in the last 5 months. I don't sound like the ordinary candidate. I don't look like the ordinary candidate. And the fact that 29,000 people were willing to vote for me, made that commitment, indicates a very serious commitment to a new style of politics.
I came, what I say is dangerously close to winning.
Scheer narrowly lost the election, garnering something on the order of 45% of the vote, but it was, as you know, regarded as a bellwether election, and it paved the way for Ronald Dellum's victory 2 years later.
So one night, I hear this candidate running for Congress, Bob Scheer, this incredibly articulate guy who was speaking with such clarity and such integrity. I came back to my guys and I said, man, I just met a bad white dude. And they said, really? I said, yeah, you gotta hear this guy.
Mind you, I'm still running a magazine, basically running it because I'm the managing editor by that point. And there were people pissed off at the magazine. What the fuck are you running for Congress for? You're supposed to be running a magazine. We're an international magazine. You know, people reading us all over the world, and you're putzing around in Oakland. I do think Ramparts was gangbusters. It was fucking gangbusters. And the whole thing was the people we were taking on. We were that breath of fresh air. We were it's what the Berkeley was. It was what the free speech movement was. Well, Ramparts, you know, it was another manifestation, but in the world of journalism. In the world of journalism, for that I have to really give Hinkle a lot of credit. We were always journalists. And he was going to transform journalism.
Where Ramparts really gets liftoff is when Warren recruits Bob Scheer. So Bob Scheer brings that kind of political analysis.
Warren is really smart too. And he was not politically radical or ideologically radical, but he was a troublemaker, a muckraker. And that's the part that he really loved. And that's why we ended up, our magazine ended up doing, you know, exposing the CIA, because he was a risk taker. And so here we have Bob, who's more the intellectual leftist, you know, has more of this sort of philosophical, political history of the left, socialism, communism. And here's Warren, who's like, yeah, let's go, you know, blow it up, you know, let's, you know, take them on, fearless. So that's one thing I loved about Warren.
The two of them together were really a dynamic duo.
I go to work in Ramparts and start 63, 64. Well, one thing I do is put the magazine squarely on the side of raising questions about this Vietnam War thing.
But, you know, the women we were in these lowly jobs which had lower pay, and we were expected to work all night to put the magazine to bed. That was, you know, that's what you do in journalism. And so we did that, but the guys would go out to Vanessi's and put it on the credit card for the magazine, and we had to pay for our own. So I organized the women, and we protested, and we got our meals paid for too. I mean, we all loved being there. I learned a tremendous amount, and it was very exciting because We were the only publication, basically, in the United States challenging the Vietnam War in the beginning, challenging all kinds of things. It was amazing work going on. Jean Marine and David Welch and Saul Stern, they would, and of course Bob.
You had the traditional liberal magazines like The Nation and The New Republic, but they didn't have anywhere near the impact that Ramparts did.
So what Ramparts did was they said, let's put some resources into this, let's make it look like Time magazine, and let's go to stories that the other publications won't touch, on Vietnam, on the CIA, on the FBI, on the Black Panthers. And if we do it in a certain way, the New York Times is going to have to pick it up.
The expose about the NSA being used by the CIA, that was a huge story. The NSA was the National Student Association. It was at that time the largest student group. But the fact that the CIA was directly involved in funding and influencing the NSA was an eye-opener for a lot of people.
Mr. Hinkle, when did Ramparts first get information regarding CIA activities and student groups that started your investigation?
Approximately 2 months ago, we had our first information on the story, and we've had a team of about 11 reporters and investigators working on it full-time ever since.
I had been living in France. I was married to a Frenchman, and I came home, and as I walked out of the airport, there was a magazine stand, and it had Ramparts magazine there. And on the cover was a Native American woman named Nenada Means. She was against a whitewashed wall where was written in red letters, "Better Red Than Dead." And I bought it, and I read it, and it changed my life. It was an article by Peter Collier, who was then a progressive person, about the history of what white European settlers had done to the indigenous people that lived here that I am ashamed to say I was not fully aware of. And it just rocked me and turned me into an activist. I went to Alcatraz. It used the occupation of Alcatraz, the Native American occupation of the island of Alcatraz, to go back and tell the whole history. And that magazine was edited by Robert Scheer.
Firing line with William F. Buckley, Jr.
My name is C. Dickerman Williams, and I shall act as chairman of this discussion between Mr. Buckley and Mr. Scheer. The subject is Ramparts anti-American? Mr. Scheer, will you answer Mr. Buckley's question?
Well, before I answer his question, let me just state, my only problem with anti-Americanism is that I don't suspect that your concept of what the core of being an American and mine would be the same.
Oh,
if you could come up with such a very simple and clear definition of what an American is, then I'm willing to talk about anti-Americanism. If you want, for purposes of rhetoric, I'm perfectly willing to use the term. I find your support of the government of South Africa and Rhodesia and the Dominican Republic and the Diem regime to be anti-American, but I'm also willing to concede that we can have a serious disagreement about what Americanism is.
Correct. I note and remark your digression and return, if you don't mind, to the subject under discussion.
Well, why is that a digression? I don't see it as a digression.
Well,
unless you're willing to define the term anti-American, we're going to sit here for an hour piddling around this point.
Because I'm not talking about South Africa, I'm talking about America.
No, but if you're not willing to define what you mean by that term, then it doesn't seem to me you should use it. Why wait until 20 minutes from now to define it?
I'm quite willing to define it, but I'm rather enjoying your embarrassment.
I don't feel the least bit embarrassed. I would rather talk about your substantive issues. I might add, I also find his contempt for freedom, his support of the McCarthy Committee, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and his own red baiting and his own attacks on anyone who dissents in this society, and in fact his efforts to make a person who was a communist to become a non-person in much the same way as the Soviet Union.
Wait. Don't go on and on and on and on.
What is the piece of writing that I'm proudest of? It's probably my letter from non-pen. And I'm not saying it's the most important, but I was there in non-pen, for a conference of Indo-Chinese people, and everyone was there. The Viet Cong were there, and North Vietnamese, and Prince Sihanouk, the head of Cambodia, addressed this conference. And so, but I was the only American journalist there. I wrote a piece. It was basically Leave It Alone. I wrote this piece really more to the left than anyone else. I said, let it be. Let them make their own history. Let them figure it out, And then I went back there next year with Stanley Scheinbaum and my wife, Ann.
But I think, for Bobby and I, we fell in love with Cambodia. it was just, everything was lush. You know, so you could so live off the land, and it was like, you know, a very underdeveloped country, extraordinarily so, but there was a peacefulness and a spirituality. And then to see what the US did, the bombing of Cambodia was just, and in fact, that's propelled the Khmer Rouge to power. And I know that, I mean, I've studied it, and it's just, it's again part of the empire and all the horrors we've committed as an empire. But I think for Bobby and I, and for a lot of our generation, I mean, the relationship we had with Vietnam and Cambodia was extremely deep.
Dr. King was having lunch at the airport with a friend, and he was flipping through some magazines, and he happened to see a Ramparts magazine, and it was a photo essay called The Children of Vietnam. And it showed some of the effects of, you know, the U.S. war on the Vietnamese, especially the toll that it took on Vietnamese children.
Ramparts was famous for having run these photographs of napalm children, these terrible wounds that they had, and their faces burned off, practically off. And the question was, do we run these photographs because they were so gruesome? Is that sensationalist to run something like this? This is the kind of thing you see it and then you don't sleep that night, you know. It was horrific. And to think that our government was doing this, you know.
It was very hard hitting. And he sort of pushed his food away and he said, I don't think I'm going to be hungry until, you know, we do something about this situation. Now his advisors told him, don't come out against our policy in Vietnam. And Dr. King said no. And he later said, as soon as I saw that issue of Ramparts magazine, I knew that I had to come out and oppose our policy in Vietnam. And, you know, that was a kind of turning point for him. And you don't get a lot of stories like that. But Ramparts could have that kind of impact.
There were people in the civil rights movement, get in your lane, Martin, you got to stay in your lane. You know, and then there were whites saying, you got to stay in your lane. Well, the New York Times editorially, stay in your lane. And they didn't even give him the courtesy of a serious news account of his speech. And when I listened to the speech and I read it, you know, I said, wow, it's an incredible manifesto. What, I mean, this just lays it out there. And it was like a big deal to get a text of it so we could publish it in Ramparts. Well, that's one of the reasons why the FBI and the CIA and everybody came after us. When you look at all the documents around that have been revealed, they went after him because he had two advisors, one black guy and one Jewish guy, who was supposed to have once been communists. Red baiting was the norm.
What they did to Martin Luther King, that was the deep state, that was the FBI, which liberals are now celebrating. But it was the FBI that tried to kill King. They're the ones who made the phony documents. They're the ones who wanted to get him to commit suicide. We were followed all the time by both the CIA and the FBI. And by the way, as a personal note, I was exonerated by J. Edgar Hoover. There's something called the Scheer file in 1972, and the big fight developed between the CIA and the FBI about whether I was an agent of some foreign government. And they couldn't find any government because as soon as they settled on one, I would denounce it. And so the FBI agents in San Francisco said, Scheer's just a good time Charlie. He just wants to find girls or something, you know. He's denounced in every single group that we've infiltrated, you know. And so finally, J. Edgar Hoover came back from Washington. They said, well, plant some drugs on him. And the guys in San Francisco had the wisdom to say, are you kidding? We'll make him a national hero. And so there is actually correspondence I finally got from the Freedom of Information where J. Edgar Hoover tells the FBI agents in San Francisco that he's closing the Scheer case, closing my file because he's not an enemy agent, and the CIA accused Hoover of betraying the security of the country.
The thing he's most proud of with Ramparts, I think he would tell you, is getting Martin Luther King to come out against the war in Vietnam. But what was interesting about that, from a news media point of view is that the news media did not grasp the importance of these two national movements joining together, the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement joining together like that.
We burned our draft cards. We took our own draft cards, burned them, and that was the cover. 4 top editors, so we were hauled before a federal grand jury in New York because of that. In San Francisco, I was hauled before another grand jury over the Panthers.
Most people view the mass arrests as being peaceful and that people went into the buses in a peaceful way, but in fact, as far as the treatment of the prisoners in Santa Rita, it was the most brutal that's taken place in the northern United States, as far as I know. Yeah, I was arrested accidentally, even though I had a press pass, and then found myself in the bus, and when we got to Santa Rita, we piled out of the bus and they began hitting us. And then they instructed everyone who had been arrested yesterday to lie down and on some gravel outside in this courtyard. It was very cold, and if you moved your feet or anything, they would hit you. And they would ask us political questions. If we gave the wrong answers, we'd be hit, or we'd have to crawl around on our knees.
Crawl, literally?
Yes. For instance, one of the medical volunteers was in our barrack this morning, and he wouldn't give the right answer to a question about who started this whole fracas, and they just pulled him right out and started beating him very badly, and he was bleeding.
And so Ramparts sends Bobby to the Middle East to go. He went to Israel, Palestine, Egypt, and he ended up writing a series of articles which were extremely fair and balanced.
One thing that was very clear to me was the Palestinians were the victims from all sides. So yes, I wrote very much out of a feeling of concern for the Palestinians. That's how I was raised as a Jew, was to have some universal sense of values, you know.
I think if you go back and look at those articles, I think they hold up pretty well. But a lot of people are upset by them, including some of the investors.
Marty Peretz, he basically pulled all the money out of Ramparts, and then other people, I think maybe they felt it tilted to be too pro-Arab. So anyway, a lot of money went down the drain.
But Ramparts was able to reorganize and relaunch without Warren, and Bob was in charge. But in short order, Peter Collier and David Horowitz led a kind of insurrection, and they actually deposed Bob.
Well, it's interesting about David Horowitz. First of all, I met David when I was in graduate school, Berkeley, and we got friendly, and we were both on the left. I brought him back from London to be at Ramparts. And David, being the wily Trotskyist, began plotting my overthrow as the editor. The critical opportunity for him is when I went off to see Eldridge in Algeria. Horowitz had the wonderful opportunity to organize the staff and to argue that I was being excessively paid and leading a bourgeois life. And it was funny because later in life he would attack me from the right, then he was attacking me from the left.
I think he was a little bitter about it. I think he felt betrayed because he had recruited these people, but he had to reinvent himself.
He had to try to figure out, how can I still be radical in my thinking and yet keep the mainstream audience? And Ramparts was the exception to the rule in that Ramparts had reached a pretty huge audience without giving up its soul, you know, but that's not the norm. So I think he started thinking, well, the way I can get a magazine or a publisher interested is to have these profiles, these interactions, and that's where he develops that skill.
When I was in my final year as a senior at Cal, he was recovering from having been overthrown in a kind of coup at Ramparts magazine a number of years earlier. He was trying to fight his way out of being blacklisted by so many publications, and he was beginning to get some jobs again, writing for Esquire and for Playboy. He had a book contract with McGraw-Hill, and he needed someone to help him with that, and I was enormously flattered, came over to the house, and since then we've been sort of in each other's lives for the next 41 years.
Later, right, this is now when I'm 9 years old, 1976, Bob does the interview with Jimmy Carter, where Jimmy Carter says he has lust in his heart, which even as a 9-year-old I thought, what's the big deal, you know, but
this is a biblical image. We all have lust in our heart. Lust is what the goddamn Bible, you know, the Old Testament is certainly all about, is lust. And so he was giving a thoughtful answer, you know. Instead, that became the hot item.
This interview blows up immediately, and Bob is on TV a lot, and I can remember my mom waking me up at like 6:45 in the morning before school and saying, "Your dad's on Good Morning America," and I would drag my blanket out to the couch and watch my dad have one of those face-off kind of interviews.
Robert Scheer says no. He's an editor of New Times Magazine. He wrote the Playboy interview with Jimmy Carter. Good morning to you both.
Bob becomes famous because of the Jimmy Carter interview, but of course he was already famous. But to me, even as a 9-year-old, I was like, this is different. Like, you just interviewed this guy running for president, and you may have changed the whole election. I mean, the biggest thing that like my father was struggling with, at least from my view, or one of the things he struggled with in the 70s, was everybody who came out of the 60s as a radical or a leader was fighting with the word sellout, right? Everybody was a sellout. So, you know, I heard about, you know, Tom Hayden becoming a sellout when he went into mainstream politics, and that was the word everybody would use, being a sellout. So of course, if you go and take money.
But I think the basic element in the American constitutional experiment was the right and obligation to question authority in every realm, beginning with government. And that's why the free press right is enshrined there, along with others. And the big shift I've seen is we had a flowering, probably the greatest, most significant, pervasive time of the flowering of that ideal in the 60s. And where it spread very far into very different sectors, apart from the civil rights movement, apart from the women's movement, apart from the anti-war movement, lots of different things, culturally, emergence of a new music, all sorts of things. Without glorifying it, without glossing over its contradictions, there's never been a better period to talk about the flowering of that kind of freedom, individual responsibility, question authority, and the signal, the slogan of that was, don't sell out. Don't sell out.
At one point we had a drink in the Hotel Algonquin, famous for hosting the Algonquin Round Table, made famous by the contributors to The New Yorker. And we sat there drinking steadily into the wee hours, and as the place emptied of people, suddenly our eyes fell upon a New York rat making its way across the carpet. And Scheer looked at the rat, looked up at me and said, "You know, Wasserman, the rats are in the toniest places, and they're here to remind us all that the corruptions of the place cannot be banished by the conceits of how well appointed they are." And it is that sensibility that has enabled Bob to be armored against selling out, a word or a phrase you barely hear anymore.
When I first came to LA to work for the LA Times, and I thought, you know, am I selling out now? What am I doing? Mass media, I'd done Ramparts and so forth. You were one of the first people I interviewed here, and you told me something then. You said, they're always going to pressure you. Your ethics are always going to be on the line. He said, and what keeps me straight, you had this old-fashioned typewriter. He said, you see this piece of paper? No one can stop me from putting that piece of paper in there, rolling it, and typing something else. You said you're basically a writer. Have we lost whatever moral fiber we had, or?
Well, you haven't. What if I suggested to you, when you were talking about looking for a hero, that you look a little more often in a mirror?
Because I think I am not interesting. I'm sorry, okay? I am a journalist because What I write about is interesting. This world is interesting. I try to do it with feeling. I can't control my feeling. I get pissed off. I get angry. I want to write about it, okay? But I am the journalist.
I was asked by my Metro editor if I knew Bob Scheer. So my editor said, can you go out to lunch with Bob and kind of talk up the place because we're trying to hire him? And I said, wow, that's surprised me because Bob was an alternative journalist. And at the paper, the LA Times was pretty staid, you know. But by then, Bob was pretty well known as a national correspondent because of the Jimmy Carter interview mostly. The LA Times decided to hire Bob to do narrative journalism for the paper.
I was brought along about a year after as his researcher. I tried to make sure that the facts were right. Scheer was always someone who had tremendous regard, tremendous respect. Facts mattered. He labored under the tyranny of facts because, of course, he lived in fear that if he got something wrong, he would be subjected to the most vicious kind of red baiting.
I started off editing all of Bob's stuff, and I remember the first story I edited, we were in our apartment, and I started reading it, and there were so many spelling errors. Bob had all these stories about when he was a child, about flunking out of classes and this and that, and then he took a test in New York. So he went to school in the Bronx. He took a test where he ended up getting like one of the highest grades in the whole city of New York. He went from being in the dummy class to being in the genius class in one afternoon.
So I go from the moron class to the genius class with this whole, not a word of explanation of what's going on. And by now I have real behavioral problems because I've gone through these 2 years at PS 89 and now I'm in high school and I got anger issues and a lot of things. And, but anyway, so I go to this genius class and she says, oh, in the co-curriculum class, here you do follow your own interests. This was like John Dewey to the extreme, I'm going to totally go with your interest. And here you can do whatever you want. And I said, whatever I want. A little belligerent. And I said, I want to go home. She said, oh, you can. So she made the mistake of giving me some pass to go home. Well, I didn't come back for, 6 weeks or something, 2 months. And the truant officer came looking and got me.
And it was hard for him but he never put it together. He never realized that he had a learning difference until our son was diagnosed.
So I had this, undiagnosed problem. And the system did its best to try to convince me I was dumb, but it made me argumentative. And it's actually been the main strength I've had as a polemicist or critic.
So Bob came out as being dyslexic publicly in a column he wrote for the Times. And I cannot, to this day, read that without crying because it was so human and so painful, what he was describing, his childhood and our son, Josh.
Take the next, go ahead, because we're going to run out of time.
One reason I'm teaching, I know, that's probably the main reason, actually. I got involved with teaching was to help kids with learning disability, and it's probably my greatest success is reaching out to kids who learn a different way or have a gap.
Bob truly loves his students, loves his class, and brings subjects to life, and he's prepared to argue every side of an issue so that when he has a guest there, the guest may take a position that one would expect Bob to agree with, but then Bob is as ornery as he can possibly be, trying to make sure that the students are exposed to the other side of that issue.
He made us think. He didn't just present ideas and say, he didn't present them to say that anything is the right way to do or the wrong way to do. He just made us think about how we should be processing the information we're being fed. And so that's what's key about Bob's class. Bob is sort of the quest for the truth. Whatever what I think is whatever that truth may be, so he doesn't think he's always right, and that's why he'll play devil's advocate on all the sides to sort of bring about the lively debate. I am a master's in public diplomacy specifically because of Bob Scheer.
The LA Times had attacked me when I ran for Congress, viciously, and not just editorially in their news section. The paper had been quite conservative, and it was Nixon's paper, and yet clearly it was becoming a much better paper. Otis Chandler was the best publisher the paper ever had. He picked a couple of very good editors to work with, Nick Williams and then Bill Thomas, who for my money was the best editor around. And they said, we want you to do what you do. There were only a couple of times at the LA Times where I had these moments of truth during the 17 years that I was a national reporter. Every time it worked out the way we had promised. One time I interviewed George Bush. It was in the '80 campaign, and it derailed his campaign because he talked about winnable nuclear war and so forth. Well, he was livid. And so he came into the building, however, after that. He came into the building. I had him speak to the editorial board and political writers and so forth. And I was invited, and I said hello to him. I had traveled with him when he was not the most prominent candidate. So he gave a speech and to the board, and one question was, do you think age will be an issue? Ronald Reagan's age. And he said, well, I'm not going to bring it up. And, the 11th commandment, Republican candidates, and then out of nowhere he says, but, being older, do you think at Ronald Reagan's age, will he be able to withstand the pounding you get from a reporter like Robert Scheer, who blah, blah. Everybody in the room is startled, and I said, oh, Jesus. And then another question came up a few questions later, like that, where he, in a gratuitous way, dragged me into it. And so as we were filing out of this room, Otis Chandler, came up to me, put his arm around me. He was taller than I am. Put his arm. He said, Bob, I've known George since college. You got the right George. Don't let this get to you. Just keep doing it.
But Bob interviewed him. He interviewed, of course, Reagan.
No. You believe we could survive a nuclear war?
No, because we have let them get so strong, and we have let them violate the agreement.
But let's say we got stronger than them again. Do you think we could survive a nuclear war? With the right underground shelter systems, with the right defense systems, could we survive one?
It would be a survival of some of your people and some of your facilities that you could start again. It would not be anything that I think in our society we would consider acceptable, but then we have a different regard for human life than those monsters do.
He interviewed Nixon, too. Nixon liked something Bob had written and invited Bob to interview him.
The biggest challenge of all was Richard Nixon. The biggest challenge from an interview point of view. And in Nixon's case, hey, my taxes had been audited by this guy. My life had been, people had been following me all over the world because of this guy, and everything. I was really on the receiving end of a lot of bad stuff from Nixon, and I certainly knew other people whose lives had been destroyed. And, I knew a lot about Cambodia. He'd ordered the Cambodian bombing. I'd been in Cambodia beginning in 1963, 64. I loved Cambodia. I know the damage, the terrible, genocide and everything.
He would pick subjects that he just thought were interesting and weren't being covered right, weren't being covered at all. And then he would bring light to them.
The good humor truck circles aimlessly through silent blocks of burned-out buildings, hunting the occasional waif still playing in the rubble who might yet desire a popsicle. This time, there is no sign of life, and the ice cream truck departs with a last ring of its merry chimes, leaving a still life of the South Bronx warscape, dotted by garbage lakes, dunes of litter, and beached hulks of abandoned cars. The streets are dead, as if locust had descended and slurped up the ring alivio and stickball games, the philosophers of the benches, the checker kings and the loud music boys, the girls with fishnet stockings and stiletto heels, and the young studs with bodies some said were good for nothing but dancing. Gone the wild, chaotic, noisy, cosmopolitan life of a borough that for decades belched up life continuously as its very mission.
Bob became very interested in AIDS, covering AIDS, because nobody was covering AIDS. Reagan, in fact, did very little to recognize AIDS as a crisis. I remember I came home one night from work. His mother lived with us, And I said, Ida, I said, you look sad, what's wrong? And she said, oh, I'm so depressed. I'm reading this book, it's so depressing. And I said, what are you reading? And she said, oh, it's this book about a disease called AIDS. And I said, Ida, I said, you're 82 or something. I said, you don't have to read about a book like that about AIDS. And she said, everybody should read this book. And she was, that's where Bob gets a lot of his, you know, who he is from this woman. Anyway, but Bob wrote about AIDS before anybody in the country was writing about AIDS. He did a whole series on AIDS. He did a series on one of his early stories, the television news industry, when TV news was getting kind of really toward entertainment more than news.
That was a wonderful series that he did. At that time, I was a lawyer specializing in communications law, and Bob's series won the Pulitzer from the jury unanimously, but the overall Pulitzer committee did not allow him to get the award that year.
So the board overturned it and gave it to another reporter from the LA Times for a series on dam safety.
It might have been related to the fact that he had given an interview in More magazine, which was then kind of a Columbia Journalism Review type magazine, in which he advocated guerrilla journalism, and some people thought that somehow that was suggesting a type of journalism that they couldn't embrace.
Bob was nominated for 11 Pulitzers in 10 years.
You like potato? And you like potato? You like tomato? And you like tomato? Potato? Potato? Tomato?
I feel that what made the show work is that these were our views. We didn't really have to prepare for it. Both Bob and I had a syndicated column. Matt Miller wrote a lot himself, so it's always much easier to be on radio and express your views when you're also a writer, because when you write, you figure out your views in a deeper way.
She was on the right in the beginning. He was on the left. And then she started moving over. So they had to kind of say she was in the center, and they had to get another person on the right.
When I started, I was on the right, and then I moved in a position that I described as beyond left and right. At the time, I was a kind of extinct species of Republican. You know, I was pro-choice, pro-gay rights, pro-gun control. So where we differed was on my understanding at the time of the role of government. I thought the private sector would step up to the plate and address all the social problems we were dealing with, and gradually, and to a large extent through my conversations with Bob, I realized that would never happen, that we actually needed the raw power of government appropriations to be able to address all the problems we're facing.
She has spoken in Bob's class, and she said it was your professor who influenced me. He made it all sound so sensible, what he was saying and writing.
So Bob was both a great friend and an amazing mentor.
Scheer is terrific on the stump, you know, passionate. And, you know, one of the things about Bob that is really important is that he has proceeded all his life as if the stakes were really high, as if serious things actually matter.
You know, I like David Halberstam personally. I liked him. At the time, I did not think that he wrote the best book about Vietnam. But he certainly had the best title of any book about American politics, The Best and the Brightest. That is the beginning of wisdom about the American condition. The great damage in our society comes from the best and the brightest.
I had two fears during my years as Secretary of Defense. One fear, and I expressed it to President Johnson in December 1965, was that we couldn't win the war militarily. I said to him at that time, and I quote it in the book, there's only a 1 in 3 chance, or at best a 1 in 2 chance to win militarily. He said, are you saying we can't win militarily? I said, yes. However, the second fear was that if we pulled out of Vietnam, it would lead to what Eisenhower predicted in 1954, the fall of the dominoes. In other words, the fear that if we didn't stand firm, the communists would take control of Southeast Asia, all of Asia, and strengthen their position against the West in Europe and the US.
I think the book is a very important one, and I think it's important because it shows how little knowledge, the abysmal ignorance that was present in the government at that time. That it shows us that the best and the brightest did not read and did not think very clearly. It makes one suspicious of any government official, and I think should lead the citizens to question what they're told is the official truth. First of all, there were senators, Gruning and Morse and Church, who were saying all these things that McNamara now says he didn't know, that Ho Chi Minh was an Asian Tito, that there was a Sino-Soviet dispute. We installed Diem Paor, this autocrat who McNamara says he detested as an autocrat and later we had killed. But I don't find any sense of contrition in this book. I think it's a bit cold-blooded in its rhetoric. There's no real sense of the lives that were lost, the damage to this country, the people who in the American military who were killed or were kept prisoner, the Vietnamese who died. What we have, I think, is someone dissembling and trying to put the best spin on what is really an atrocious complicity.
But there was in Bob a deliberate renunciation of the East Coast, a deliberate renunciation of the cozy suffocations of the Washington, New York, Boston nexus, and a deliberate embrace of a kind of freewheeling West Coast bohemianism. The heady bohemianism of Ferlinghetti's San Francisco and of Berkeley in those days, I think, was a tonic to him. I think it hurt him with respect to a national reputation, despite the fact that he was a columnist for the Los Angeles Times, and despite the fact that those columns would from time to time get picked up. As I say, geography is fate, and the Los Angeles Times, for all its good reporting, was still regarded by most of the rest of the country as provincial.
But the bottom line at the LA Times was, they're going to hire me because I add something to their mix, which if they're a commercial enterprise makes them commercially more viable, if they need some kind of balance for whatever reason, and then when they don't need that, they fire you. You know, or when there's too much of that, they fire you, right? I mean, that's what it's all about, because their main concern is not necessarily journalism or truth or anything else. It's some kind of mix that they're marketing.
Last week, the Los Angeles Times announced it's firing longtime columnist Robert Scheer. He's been at the Times for 30 years. He was one of the most progressive voices there. In recent years, his columns took on the Bush administration and its justifications for the invasion of Iraq. In a posting at the Huffington Post blog, he wrote, quote, "The publisher, Jeff Johnson, who's offered not a word of explanation to me, has privately told people he hated every word I wrote. I assume mostly refers to my exposing the lies used by President Bush to justify the invasion."
Bob's whole thing with work has always been, you have to have more than one job so you can tell people to fuck off if they push you. You need to be independent and able to walk away. And the LA Times really tested that for him, because it was hard for him to just walk away from that. He really valued having that audience in this city. You know, he had his political column once a week, and he had his local column, which at one point was twice a week. And he became a voice and a personality on the west side of LA and got a lot out of that. So that went away, and then he lost his column, and I think he was pretty devastated. He felt like that was his home. He'd left his freelance career for the most part to go to the LA Times. He met his wife, my mom, at the LA Times.
I think it's a shabby business that the LA Times let Bob go when he came under some suspicion of writing obsessively about our blunders in Iraq.
Take the recent post-9/11 experience. We wouldn't have gone into Iraq, this place we've made. Who ever thought we could make Saddam Hussein look good? You know, we're making Assad look good. We're making Gaddafi look good. We can make any monster in the world look good by our efforts to bring democracy. You know, we bring chaos, we bring madness. It's absolutely insane, thoughtless. You know, and we have this ability. Why? Because we don't have an informed public. You could lie to the public about the basic two reasons for going into Iraq. There were no weapons of mass destruction. You knew it in real time, but you lied. And secondly, you lied about Saddam Hussein's connection with Al-Qaeda. It was the one place in the Mideast where Al-Qaeda could not operate. It's an absolute lie. And yet you make this intervention.
The thing I think is so frustrating for him is there's no prize for being right after the fact. You know, on KCRW, on Left, Right, and Center, which was a very popular show that lots of people listen to, so people will know for really years before and during the Iraq War, Bob was far outnumbered on the panel by people who thought it was either a very good idea to invade Iraq, or it was going swimmingly, or it could very easily go much better if only we would do X, Y, and Z. And obviously Bob was 100% right about the Iraq War. And so what? There's no prize for that. And in fact, in addition to his career, Bob has had to pay a price, I think, with his friendships, because a lot of people that, you know, they go way back and there's mutual love there, I think had a really hard time dealing with some of his issues. I think people don't realize Bob is not a Democrat. He's not a liberal. He's a person who has a view of the world that's informed by his experience growing up in poverty during the end of the Depression and World War II and through the 60s and the Civil Rights Movement. And that is where his values come from, and he's not loyal to a movement or a party. He really has a basic test of human decency, and that's more important to him than, he doesn't see it as his job to help someone become president, certainly. And no journalist should.
I come from a tradition on the left where getting it right, and I don't mean in some doctrinaire sense, was critical to your set of values. Ive Stone would go to hearings and report on them. He'd get the congressional record. He'd get the committee reports and documents and, you know, read them with his glasses up by his nose, you know, and he did that kind of work. And then he'd throw it back at them. And that's where I learned journalism from the journalists that I really admired. Izzy was not writing his columns because it was going to make him a celebrity or something. He was doing it because he was trying to pursue the truth.
Izzy Stone did not accept at face value what the administration said or the other reporters, the Washington establishment reporters said. But he would just dig into everything and show that they were wrong. Well, that's what Bob has. That's why Bob is, to me, an inspirational editor. And he's able to take a reporter like me and inspire me to do the same, you know, to dig, like the name of the site says, Truthdig.
Truthdig.com, we really want to carry on and do investigative journalism. We landed on the idea of doing a website, and we came up together collaboratively, you know, with the idea of Truthdig, and it was in the works, and we had kind of a prototype, and we were going to launch the beta version, but in fact, when he was fired from the Los Angeles Times for his national column and had so much public support, it propelled us to just like go ahead and launch and take advantage of the goodwill and continue his voice.
We call it Truthdig because we think that you can get to a truth, that the truth matters because lives are sacrificed, bad policies are followed, and so forth. You're also making the assumption that ultimately a republic in a democratic society will value the truth. We'll find ways to support it, okay?
A lot of what he would do is just pick up the phone and say, get this up on the website. This thing is happening, people need to be talking about it. Why aren't we writing more about Gaza, for example, the many times that Israel bombed Gaza or, you know, shot at people from across the border, or, you know, that was just generally in the news. You say this is a taboo subject, but people aren't talking about it. It's crazy what's happening. We should be talking about it. And he would call us up and he would say, I've got this writer who's going to write about this, or go find a writer who can write about this, or I'm going to write about this. And he would force it up on the site, even if we were, you know, to say, oh, we already have a schedule and we can't really fit that in right now. He really is a toughie at Truthdig. He's the boss, and he really will insist that things go up, that people should be talking about.
Our first really great story was one I'm very proud of. It concerned the death of Pat Tillman, a professional football player. And he and his brother Kevin had joined the Rangers. The idea of being ordinary people should not have to bear the price of war, even athletes. Kevin was a baseball player, Cleveland Indian system. And they went to Afghanistan, and Pat was killed in an incident that was first lied about as if, you know, it was a heroic thing. He was heroic, but not, that's not the way he died. He died because of American troops. And then there's a lot of suspicion about that, which I have to this day. I had written a column about it. My wife ended up writing a book. Kevin Tillman, Pat's brother, wrote a piece about the meaning of Pat's death and the reaction to it.
When that came out, you had Wolf Blitzer walking over to his computer and saying, this major story just broke on this little website, Truthdig, and actually on CNN showed an image of the Truthdig website. And you had the AP doing several stories on it. It was the Washington Post's biggest story. The New York Times then did a story, and so it just went viral.
And it took us off the charts. It established Truthdig. We've won 6 Webbies, the Internet Award, where we've been the best political website.
Wall Street, what fucking thieves.
You also have to divorce his speeches, you know, that he makes from the kind of journalism that he does, like his work on the banks, digging into the whole financial picture and the run up to the recession and who profited from that, was really pioneering stuff. I mean, other people were doing it. He wasn't the only one, but other people were doing it. But that kind of journalism, and he was a leader in that, set the stage for a critical thinking of the bailout, and really was the intellectual background of the Sanders campaign.
The LA Times used to be called the Velvet Coffin. We actually flew first class. We actually stayed at good hotels, you know. But the economy of that couldn't even been sustained without the internet. Already the profit margins were declining. The internet came in and just unmasked the whole thing, okay? Online journalism is not paying for anyone. That's why I wrote this whole book about They Know Everything About You. One of the things in that book is that the destruction of print did not create a self-sustaining operational model to take its place, because advertising on the internet is tiny compared to the cost. And that is because the advertisers don't have to go to you. They don't have to go to the New York Times. They can pick up your readers by data mining. I think the most disturbing thing is that our CIA could go in and do data mining. Government leaks become more important. If information is more difficult to obtain because it's costly by news organizations and they can't send reporters out to cover the war, the government will always be more than willing to give you information. So there's that whole element, a rising power of governments all over the world, their ability to control news, and a lack of independent alternative organizations. Right. I do a podcast now for KCRW. I have to help raise the money for it. There's still the idea, get behind public radio and television?
Listen, we should be able to find the ability to support a strong, robust, public media. That's not just television or radio, but that's also the internet that people can access, that they can learn on, that they can participate in.
Everybody talks about the internet being so irresponsible because anybody can put something out. Well, that's what the great pamphleteering tradition in America was all about. If you could find somebody to print on their letterpress your rights of man, your document, you could find a big audience. You know, this is how our Declaration of Independence got circulated. The press that's enshrined in our Constitution, our First Amendment, free press, was often a scurrilous press. It was made up of town criers and dissidents and pamphleteers.
Fake news is a term that is dangerous because it pulls in a lot of different disparate things. Like there's in the truest sense, it's right, it's people who are paying to have literal fake news on literally fake news websites created and then promoted on Facebook for various means, whether it's financial gain or political gain. And then there are sites like Truthdig that have a very deliberate point of view. I think that it's important for people to value journalism and resist genuine fake news, but it also has been used as a way of dismissing progressive media outlets and conservative media outlets.
I would say the most overwhelming feeling I had about journalism in America, and I have it about the university as well. I have been in totalitarian countries where people do get their fingernails pulled out. They do get their genitals crushed. They do get put into terrible conditions. But when I look at my colleagues, I always think, you know, your fingernails are not being torn out, you know, and your family is not going to be targeted for murder that we know of. I mean, but it's not really in your mind. We're talking about some, you know, kink in your career trajectory, you know. So then I say, shame on you. And that goes for all the people who didn't tell us what Edward Snowden told us, or Chelsea Manning, or Daniel Ellsberg. Why weren't there more of this? We have a clearly established principle that if you think crimes have been conducted in your name by your government, you know, the killing of innocents in Iraq, which was what motivated Bradley Manning, or intruding on people's privacy and manipulating them, that you have an obligation to speak up. You have an obligation to express that. And if you feel the channels are blocked, and they certainly are in connection with the National Security Agency, there are no channels for an individual to speak up, then you have an obligation to become a whistleblower. That's not some foreign notion. That's something that came out of our tradition. That's our law. We held people accountable. And I think we should recognize what we have at stake here is that there are some brave souls that think freedom is non-negotiable. It defines their soul, their essence, their commitment, their moral core, and they're going to be true to it, and we should back them. I had one commitment to myself. To the degree that I am a public person, I'm giving a speech, I'm writing something, I'm teaching, I want to be as honest as I possibly can be and not betray the trust that people are putting in me. For me, that was the highest obligation. Lawrence Ferlinghetti, my favorite quote, keep an open mind, but not so open your brains fall out, okay?